What is going on, everybody? Welcome to video number 4 of my Lightroom tutorial series. In today's video, we are going to be talking about how to edit your photo in the Develop module in Lightroom. Now, let me start off by saying that to do this video, I am just going to walk you guys through what my workflow is in editing a photo. And from there, I want you guys to just be able to develop your own workflow and just take examples of what I do today and put them towards creating your own workflow. So again, I'm going to show you guys how I edit a photo, and then just take examples from what I do and apply it to how you want to develop your own photos, because my way may not be the same as how you want to do your editing, but that's all right. The whole point here is I am just going to show you guys how the development process can work and give you guys an idea of what the Lightroom Develop module can do. So to start off, we've got our photo loaded in our screen here, a lovely photo, if I do a little humble brag here, of a male house finch sitting here on a branch. You can tell it's a male because it's got his nice little red coloring coming out. I believe they do that during the spring season when they're getting ready to mate, but that's not the point here. We're going to talk about how to edit a photo. As you can see up here, I have all of my Develop module panels customized to how I do my workflow. This is a great thing that Lightroom introduced a couple of updates previously. You could customize your Develop module layout to how you want to do your workflow. So if we right click over here in the panel layout, you see this option that says Customize Develop Panel. Now really quickly, if I just hit default order, as you can see here, this is the basic layout that Lightroom gives you when you first start using the program. And from here, you can drag the different panels that you want to use up different spots. If you want to maybe work on sharpening your photo before doing the basic developments, you can drag that to the top. If you want to work on color after you do your basic developments, you can drag that. I'm going to hit cancel here. And as you can see over here, I have my panel laid out how I like to edit my photo. So what I mean there is my workflow. So let's just jump into this here and get started. The first thing I always do is apply my lens correction. And if we click on profile here, you've got two buttons that you can check mark here. The first one is remove chromatic abbreviation. So let's just zoom into the corner here. I shot this with my 150 to 600 millimeter lens. It's a pretty clean, sharp lens, and we don't get a lot of chromatic abbreviation, but as you can, or chromatic aberration, my mistake. I always say abbreviation, I don't know why. But as you can see up here, we have a slight bit of color fringing up in the sides. And if we zoom over here maybe to this out of focus section, we see just a little bit of green tint as well. Probably because we had some higher dynamic lighting out in those areas. If we scoot over to this corner here, I'm not seeing a lot. And if we look at the bird, not seeing any at all. But what remove chromatic aberration does, if you click on it, is that tells Lightroom to remove those color fringings. And if we click back up into this corner here, you can see if I toggle this on and off and on, I should say, you can see that we have basically removed that chromatic aberration that popped up in this photo. And if I zoom into this corner here, you can see, yeah, that's done a pretty good job of that as well. And then if we click on enable profile corrections, this tells Lightroom that, hey, I shot this with a Tamron 150 to 600 millimeter lens, and it will apply that lens profile to this image. And what that does is it will tell Lightroom to correct for a certain amount of barrel distortion and vignetting that's caused when you take the photo. So as you guys can see, when I checkmarked enable profile corrections, down here it applied the make, model, and profile to the photo specific to the lens I used. Now you can manually select the lens profiles as well, and this is helpful if you have a lens that doesn't electronically communicate with the camera. For example, if you had a Rokinon manual 14 millimeter lens, I know those lenses are completely manual and they don't have much electronic communication with the camera. So you would manually have to select that lens type to apply the profile. But for most modern lenses and most modern cameras, Lightroom does a pretty darn good job of applying the profile that you want. And then down here, you have the option to manually adjust that profile as you see fit. So say, for example, I didn't like the amount of distortion correction that Lightroom applied. I can click on distortion and drag it back or drag it forward and apply more or less correction if I want to. The Tamron 150 to 600 lens is a pretty well corrected lens, so I don't really play with that too much. Some of my more cheaper Canon lenses, sometimes I will use this a lot more heavy-handedly, but for this lens, I'm not too worried about that. And then down here, you also have the vignetting, and you can decrease or increase the amount of vignette that the camera, or that the lens, I should say, applied when you took the picture. Most of the time when I click check enable profile corrections, it does a fairly adequate job for me. So I don't mess with that too much. Sometimes I'll correct the distortion, especially like I said with my Canon lenses, but for the most part it does a great job. Now up here you have the manual button. Now this would come into play, let's say if, and just for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to deselect remove chromatic aberration. So if we click up here, you can see that color fringing is back. Say for whatever reason Lightroom didn't do a very good job of removing that chromatic aberration. Sometimes it happens. If you click on manual up here like I just did, you can go down here and you have this option for defringing, and this allows you to control the amount of color fringing that you can remove from the photo. So let's just say this purple fringing up here that we're seeing, and there's a little bit of green fringing as well too. You can control how much of that you want removed, or if you totally want it removed. And as you can see, as I slide this purple slider over to the right, we have lost a lot of that green fringing. So I'm just going to double click on amount to bring it back, and you can see that fringing is back. So again, just going to demonstrate removing that chromatic aberration. That does a pretty darn good job. And then as you can see, we may have a little bit of green fringing here. So I'm just going to drag the green slider and pull it to the right, and it's done a really good job of removing that green fringing. If we go over here where I know we had some green fringing, you can see that if I pull this back, it's doing a pretty darn good job of removing that. So that's another way to do it. Again, with certain types of lenses, Lightroom doesn't do a great job of removing chromatic aberration, so you can always jump over here and remove it manually, and you can also down here apply or remove vignettes caused by the lens if you so wish. So that is step number one that I do to edit my photos. So I'm just going to collapse this panel here. Now we're going to drop down to the next panel here, and this is our basic developments panel. This is where you will do a lot of the base corrections or edits that you want to do to your photo, and we have a lot of different options here. Now, first off, let me say, and this is something I probably should have said at the beginning, that this photo looks quite flat. It kind of has that gray kind of tone to it. That is because when I loaded this into Lightroom, I loaded the raw file. And when you load the raw file, you are going to have kind of just a flat looking picture, not a lot of tone adjustments to it that you would have seen on the back of your camera, and that's because your camera will automatically apply its inbuilt adjustments to the JPEG that you see on the back of your camera when you take the photo. Here we just have the flat raw file, and what's great about shooting in RAW is that you have a lot of data to work with, and you can really push and pull the files a lot more than you can a JPEG, and it's non-destructive. So I am just going to freehand this photo here, and usually I start with my white color balance. I usually shoot with auto white balance in my camera unless I'm shooting a specific scene that needs a specific white balance, and I usually will just adjust in Lightroom once I've got the file loaded. But I'll just show you guys really quickly. If you wanted to do just some quick white balance adjustments, you can click on this drop down here, and we have a ton of different options here. So if I click auto, that would tell Lightroom to apply what it thinks would be the correct white balance to this photo, and that's not too bad. It made it a little bit warmer than I would have liked to have gone for, and applied a little bit more magenta than I really want to see in this photo, but overall not too bad. If we click on Daylight, ooh, that's not bad. It's a little bit cooler, but it's definitely applied a little bit too much magenta for my tastes. If we go to cloudy, and let's just see, oh yeah, as you can see, that applies quite a warm texture to it. And guys, I'm just showing you all this so you get an idea of what you can do with the color balance tool in the basics panel. I am going to just go back to as shot, because again, like I said, I like to manually adjust my white balance. And this actually isn't too bad. I'm going to warm it up just a tad, just a tiny bit. And you may not be able to perceive this on your monitor, but I'm just going to double click again. As you can see, as shot, a little bit cooler. So I'm just going to very minutely just warm it up just a tad. And then I'm going to apply just a hint of magenta here. That's looking pretty good. Again, you guys might not be able to tell, so I'm just going to over exaggerate this here. This is the magenta slider. I really don't want it that magenta looking. So I'm just going to apply just a hair. +4 looks pretty darn good. And if I take this slider backwards, you can see it'll apply more of a green tint to it, which, not for this photo, especially not with that red bird. So I'm just going to reset that, and I'm just going to drag it just a little bit, somewhere around 4 to 7. That looks pretty good. Now, something I want to touch on really quickly in the basics panel here is you also have these color profiles. And Adobe has a built-in series of color profiles that you can apply to a photo if you so choose. And this is just another creative tool that you can use to kind of give yourself a head start with your photos. I usually leave everything on the Adobe color profile because I think it's a pretty good, pretty neutral looking profile that gives me a lot of flexibility to work with. If I wanted to maybe make this photo pop just a little bit, I would apply the landscape profile, and as you can see, got quite a nice little pop in the shadows and the highlights here. That'd be good for like a landscape image. If we go to portrait here, we've got a little bit of a flatter profile, gives me a lot of room to play with my highlights and shadows. If we go down to vivid, it makes everything really punchy and contrasty. And again, these are just profiles that you can use to give yourself kind of a head start. I usually leave everything on Adobe Color because I'm the kind of guy that wants to do everything manually. So sorry for going a little bit out of order there, but just wanted to show you guys that really quickly. So back to what we were doing. We've already done our color adjustments here. Now I'm going to drop down and play with the contrast and exposure and my highlights and shadows. So this photo is pretty darn well exposed. If you look up at my histogram here, nothing is clipped in the highlights, nothing's clipped in the shadows. And honestly, I really don't feel like this photo needs too much of brightening. Maybe if I pop the exposure up just a little bit, just under 1/3 of a stop, that's not bad. Bring out this bird just a little bit. And I've got to be really careful here because I can see quite a few sky segments here, and if I'm not careful, I'm going to blow those highlights out. So really quickly here, I'm just going to grab the contrast slider and kind of slide it to the right. And this contrast slider is applying local contrast selections to the photo. So wherever Lightroom thinks it's got good contrast in the image is where it will apply those. And as you can see, if I double click on this to bring it back to where it was, everything's still looking a bit flat. If I push this to the right to apply contrast, as you can see, we're starting to get some nice shadow detail here in the bird and maybe underneath the branches here. And we're also getting some more highlight detail in these bright areas here and maybe on these feathers. So that's pretty cool. If we drop down here, we've got our 4 sliders that control our highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. So for highlights, obviously, it's what it sounds like. You have the highlighted sections of your photo where you've got bright highlight details here, like this big open space right here. If we push this to the right, we're going to make those highlight areas brighter. Now you gotta be really careful with this because if you push it too far, if I hover my mouse up here at this clipping highlights area of my histogram, you can see with these red splotches here, I've blown out my highlights. So gotta be a little bit careful. And actually, I'm gonna go in the reverse. I'm actually going to bring my highlights back so that they don't overpower the photo. And then down here, I am going to just push my shadows just a little bit to the right. And what this does is it opens up that shadow detail for things that may have been darker in your photo. So again, if I double click on this and reset it, watch these darker areas. These darker areas are going to start lightening as I drag the slider to the right. Now that's way too much, not what I wanted, so I'm going to reset again, and I'm just going to subtly bring out some of my shadow details here. Sorry, I tripped over my tongue. Now I'm just going to do a little bit of adjustments with my blacks and whites in this photo. And that's just like it sounds. Your black and white sliders will make local adjustments to the black details and white details in your photo. So a good way to visualize what you are getting when you mess with these sliders is to hold Alt. So when you hold Alt and then click on one of your sliders, your screen goes white. That's completely normal. You haven't messed anything up. If I start dragging my slider to the left, which will introduce more black into the black areas of my photo, you'll start seeing here little areas of your photo starting to appear in the white on your screen. And this is just telling you how far you can push your black slider to the left until you start getting clipping in areas. So if I release Alt and release that, I can now look at where I have introduced those black areas. So if I hit reset here and start dragging that back to the left, you can start seeing we're starting to get more contrast in our dark areas of the photo, maybe up here in this trunk, and then on the bird here, we're starting to get some contrast in the darker sections of its feathers. Now, in kind of the reverse of that, you've got your white slider here, and this will brighten white areas or darken white areas of your photo. So for example, if I drag this to the left, you can see all these white areas are starting to get much darker. Now, this is obviously starting to make the photo look flat, so I don't really want to do that. I usually play with my blacks and whites to introduce more contrast into my photos because I like my photos to be just a little bit punchier. So holding Alt, again, same concept except we've gone black here, and it's gone black simply in the reverse of what we do with the black slider. So I'm just going to push this a little bit, and as you can see, not too far before I start getting clipping. And you really need to be careful with your whites because it's much easier to clip your highlight areas than your shadow areas. So as you can see, we've gone back to our photo here and we've introduced a lot more white into this photo. I'm going to reset this really quickly, and just to show you guys what it is actually doing visibly, if I keep dragging this to the right, we are starting to see more highlighted white areas coming in to the photo. And I'm just going to push this to the extreme just to show you guys what it would do. Obviously that's far too much and too crunchy, so I'm going to reset here and just very subtly, because I actually don't have a lot of room to play with my highlights here, just subtly introduce a little bit of white. So that is looking pretty good right here. Nice kind of punchy, contrasty photo. So we're going to drop down here to the last section of the basics panel, and we've got our texture, clarity, dehaze, vibrance, and saturation. Clarity, vibrance, and saturation have all been in this section for a very long time here. During the last major update, dehaze got moved up to this basics panel. Originally, it was down in the calibration panel, which made it a little hard to find when you wanted to use it, and a lot of photographers like to use that for landscape or other sorts of photos. So the developers moved it up here to the basics panel. And then texture has been a recent addition to Lightroom, and that really affects some of the more mid-level pixel sharpness of a photo. So let's just zoom in on this bird here, because I feel like this is going to be a good example of what these sliders can do here. So I'm just going to grab the texture slider and I'm going to push it to the right, and as you can see, we're starting to get a lot of detail in the bird's feathers and in some of the branches around it. And again, I'm pushing this to the extreme just to give you guys an idea. So that is what the texture slider can do. I'm just going to reset this really quickly and pump this up to my desired level. Usually I go somewhere in the 30s, so we got nice detail here in the feathers. And then clarity you got to be super careful with. And I know early examples of photos where people have been playing around with the clarity slider and they've pushed it just way too far. As an example here, this is where you push the clarity slider way too far. Everything's really bright and crunchy, super detailed, but it also just looks super kind of fake. Now, if you want to use this for artistic expression, go for it. I'm not telling you not to do that. I'm just saying this makes everything really crunchy and very contrasty and not my cup of tea. So I'm going to reset this, and I'm just going to introduce, again, zooming in on the bird here to show an example. just going to introduce a very subtle amount of clarity. In fact, that's too much. I'm going to back that off to roughly around plus 10. So again, reset, and then slide it up to about plus 10. A nice little adjustment in the sharpness and the visual, just visually seeing what this has done to the photo here. But again, clarity is something you want to be kind of careful with, because it's very easy to overdo. But as you can see, nice detail in the bird here and in the trees. And in fact, I'm going to bring my texture slider down because now it's become just a little bit too much. So I'm going to bring that down to about 20. That's much better. Now it doesn't look quite so overly sharpened. And then dehaze. Now this is a great tool to use if you have a landscape image, but I also find it kind of useful for wildlife as well because it helps bring out some details as well. So I'm just going to use this as an example going both ways here. Let's pump it to the right. And as you can see, we are starting to get a little bit more contrast, a little bit more dark tones in the photo here. And this is great if you have a lot of haze in the sky or anything that's kind of like doing some obscuring. Say you got some smoke in the sky. I'm going to back this off to roughly around 10% because I don't need a lot. And as you can see, I'm kind of clipping my shadow areas here with all these adjustments that I've done. So I want to be sort of careful here. We did have some very dark areas of this photo. So, you know, it was only a matter of time before I clipped my highlights here. Clipped my shadows here. So let's just punch dehaze the other way. And as you can see, this is making everything a little bit lighter, a lot lighter as I keep going here. And where I can see this coming into play is if you want to make a very kind of dreamy, airy sort of effect to your photo. Very rarely do I push it this way, but you can certainly just play around with it and make it look however you want it to. So I'm just going to reset this here, and I honestly don't need much dehaze at all. In fact, I'm just going to maybe put in like 2% here. That looks pretty good. So now we're going to talk vibrance and saturation. Vibrance will affect local color adjustments in the photo. So let's say, for example, I want to maybe increase the vibrance of the red on that bird. I am just going to punch it to the right here, and as you can see, that red is getting a lot brighter and a lot more saturated. And so are some of the yellow tones here. In fact, this is so much here that I'm going to back my white balance off here a little bit, make this photo look a little cooler. Maybe there we go. So I've gone for a cooler tone now. So that is something to be aware of if you're affecting the Vibrance tool. It will affect that color palette. Now, saturation will increase or decrease the overall amount of color saturation in the photo. So if I pump this to the right here, you can see our reds and our oranges and yellows are starting to become super saturated. And again, guys, I'm overdoing this just to show you what it will do. If we reset and start going the other way, we're going to obviously lose a lot of color here. And that's actually kind of cool. That is a very neat artistic expression of this photo right here. You can push it all the way and obviously take all the color out of a photo, and then you've got a nice kind of black and white shot. But we don't want to do that. We've got this nice red looking bird here. So I am not going to do a heck of a lot to the saturation. I'm going to increase it maybe just minimally, just +5. And then my vibrance, I'm probably, just going to leave it there roughly around 10, just to go for that subtle look right there. And now that I've done that, everything's a little bit cooler for my taste. I'm going to warm it up just a tad. There, something like that. That's pretty good. So guys, that is a rundown of the basics panel here. So that was quite a lot of time we spent there. So I'm going to try and see if I can speed through some of these other panels here. Something I want to say really quickly, all of these adjustments are local adjustments that are made to the photo. So Lightroom is selecting the local areas that it thinks need to be affected when you select those sliders. And if we just go down here really quickly to this before and after toggle right here, you can see this is the photo we had before, very flat, very dull, and over on the right here are the adjustments that we've made. So I'm just going to toggle that off, go back to the full screen view here, and now I'm going to collapse the basic panel here. Now what Tone Curve will do to your photo is it will affect adjustments to your photo globally, meaning the whole photo will be affected. Now I have my tone curves panel set up to give me these sliders down here to help me affect a little bit more easily how I do adjustments with the tone curve. If you don't want to have these sliders here, simply click on this little button right here in the tone curve and it will collapse this section, and now you can just freehand just put points down of where you want to affect the photo. I'm just going to throw in a normal S curve here just to show you guys what it does. Obviously that's too much. I'm not going to use this here for this photo, but I just wanted to show you guys what you can do with this button engaged. You can just put points wherever you want and just make adjustments to the photo. So with this button engaged, again, you can just select where you want on the line and you can make adjustments as you want to. So very simply, you can just click and drag and it will tell Lightroom the adjustments that you want to have done to the tone curve. Now I'm going to right click, flatten curve, and bring it back to what I had before. So what this line represents here, the line goes from your lightest points on your photo, meaning your highlights, to your darkest points, meaning your blacks and your shadows. And so in here in this rough area is our midtones here in the middle. So let's just apply a very simple S curve to this photo. So I'm going to click up here in my highlights area and I'm just going to push it up, and as you can see, we're brightening the highlights, and you don't have to push very far to affect a change in this photo. Then I'm going to come down here to my shadows, and I'm just going to click on it again, creating this little point, and drag it below the line, and as you can see, lots of global adjustment to my shadows. And I've made this far too punchy and contrasty, but again, guys, just demonstrating what the tone curve does. So I'm going to flatten the curve here. Now you can also grab these points down here at the top and bottom and drag them out, and this affects the base point of what Lightroom will do to your blacks and your whites. So I've dragged the blacks out to the left here. I'm just going to drag the whites up here to the top, and as you can see, we're introducing a lot of local contrast. Again, just making the photo a little bit too crunchy, but again, just demonstrating what this process can do to your photo. Again, I'm going to right click, flatten curve, and bring this back out. And then I am going to click on this button here because I like having these sliders available to me because it gives me just a little bit more finer control of the editing process. So I honestly don't need to do a lot to this photo. We already have a lot of contrast in it. So I think I am just going to just kind of grab my dark slider and push just a little bit. And as you can see, globally, even with that little adjustment of -5, we've introduced quite a bit of dark black into this photo here. And honestly, I think that's pretty good right there. I don't need to push my highlights any farther. In fact, those are getting way too close to being completely blown out. And as you can see, we have a little bit of clipping in our shadow areas here. I'm not too worried about that. The dark of the bird's eye was completely black to start with, and this dark area here was completely black to start with, so it was inevitable that we were going to get a little bit of clipping in those areas there. I don't worry too much about clipping my photos as long as it's just a minimal amount, just a very tiny, small amount. If I push it way too far, as you can see, you're making everything dark here as I push the darks farther to the left. If I go up to my clipping warning here, you can see we're starting to get more clipping in the photo, and if I push it all the way to the left here, if I go up to my histogram, you can see we have this huge spike on the left here. And if I go up to my clipping warnings here, we have a lot of black areas that have been clipped. So you want to avoid this. So I am going to just reset right there, disengage that, and again, just going to introduce a tiny bit of contrast in my darks. -5, that's looking pretty darn good. So that is the tone curve panel. And if you want to disengage something really quickly that Lightroom has had for quite a while, if you want to disengage or turn off the adjustments that you've done with everything but the basics panel, you can click on this little toggle here that's on the side of the panels, and you can go on and off, and it will show you what your photo looked like before and after. So pretty cool feature right there. Good thing to do for your referencing. Now we're going to drop down to the HSL color panel. And this is a fun little panel because this allows you to target specific colors in your photo. So for example, if I want to affect the red in this bird, it's looking a little dark maybe, I want to increase the brightness of it, I can go down here to the red section right here and I can click on it, and now I've got the red channel selected, and I can push and pull the brightness or darkness of the photo. So I'm just doing this here as an example to you guys. Luminance obviously is the brightness or darkness of that certain color. So I'm going to push it to the right here because I want that red to be just brighter, and I've got quite a bit of room to play with here before the colors start getting washed out or a little bit wonky. So I am going to just push that, probably, I want to be subtle, but probably around plus 31, something like that. And then I'm going to increase the saturation just a touch. Remember, guys, be very, very light-handed with your saturation increases. Plus 9 is looking pretty good. And then up here, you can affect the hue of the photo. So say I wanted this red to be more magenta or maybe maroon in color. I can push it this way, and this is starting to look unnatural, but again, I'm just showing you guys an example here. So that's looking just a little bit unnatural, but I'm going to quickly reset, and then I'm going to push this to the other way. We're starting to get some oranges, again, looking a little bit unnatural. That is looking okay. I'm going to just push this a little bit to the left, introduce a little bit more redder tones, and that's looking really good here. If I wanted to mess around with the oranges of this photo, because you can see up in these branches here, we've got quite a bit of oversaturated orange. If I wanted to pull these back to something a little bit more natural looking, that's looking pretty good. And we've affected the saturation there. You can also click on over here in the panel, I have color highlighted. If you click on HSL, this will actually give you the complete rundown of all your colors in both hue, saturation, luminance, and then you can click on all and it gives you a huge panel adjustment and you can affect them all at the same time. I like to target color by color. So now we're going to drop down to the Details tab, and this is where you can make adjustments to the sharpness levels of your photo. So just punching into this bird here, for example, we've got a really good amount of sharpness and detail, but we can always affect it a little bit more. Up here, if you select this little button, this gives you the ability to select in this little preview screen that you see here in the details panel where you want to see your details preview. Now I'm just going to go over here and I'm just going to select the beak and some feather area of the bird, and then we can do some sharpness adjustments as we see fit. Now, depending on the quality of your lens, you may not want to do any sharpening at all. This Tamron 150 to 600 is pretty sharp throughout the range, a little bit soft on the 600 side, but I had a very good focus on this bird, so lots of detail going on right here. But just for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to mess around with the sharpness. So if I click this and start dragging to the right, you can see in the panel here, we're starting to get some sharpness brought out in the beak, maybe in the feathers. But what we're also doing, and where you need to be careful with sharpening in Lightroom, is we're also basically sharpening the pixels. And what that can cause a problem with, say if you shot in a higher ISO range, is you're going to start sharpening the noise of your photo as well. So how we affect that is by grabbing the masking tool in the details panel. And a good way to visualize what your masking looks like is if you grab the Alt button, or click on the Alt button I should say, and now you can start seeing where the sharpness is being applied in your photo. So if I drag this back all the way to the left here, it is going to apply the sharpness universally throughout the photo. Now if I start dragging to the right here, what you're starting to see, white areas are where sharpness is being applied. Black areas is where sharpness is not being applied. So I am telling Lightroom where I want the sharpness applied in the photo. So mostly I just want it applied to the bird and maybe some of the branches that are in focus and not the noise. Now it's not a perfect selection, but it is a very, very useful tool to use. So if I release this, now we've applied the sharpening only to the areas that I want. And again, I've probably over sharpened this a bit, so I'm going to back this off. Again, the sharpening tool is something you've got to be very subtle with, but a very useful tool. I'm probably going to leave this roughly about 70, 80% right there. Now the radius and detail sliders can help you refine the selection of your sharpening. As you can see, as I push the radius to the right here, we're starting to see a little bit more detail brought out in the feathers here. Again, guys, you want to be very, very subtle with your sharpening. It's very easy to overdo, so I'm just going to reset this and just push this not very far, 1.2, again, just a smidge of the photo. And then detail, this is going to help you bring out some of the detail in your photo, some of the details in these feathers and the beak. I'm going to push this too far just to show you what it will do. As you can see, I'm starting to get some weird artifacting in the noise and in the pixels, so I'm going to reset this and just subtly increase this just a little bit. Down here in noise reduction. Now this is where if you had a very noisy photo, something that was shot in your higher ISO range, you can tell Lightroom to reduce the noise of that photo, and that is done with this luminance slider. And if we select this and start sliding it to the right, as you can see, we're starting to reduce the noise of this photo. And as you can see, as we're adjusting this here, a lot of the noise has pretty much dissipated and it's looking a lot flatter and cleaner. Where you have to be careful with this is noise greatly affects the sharpness and detail of subjects in your photo. So as you can see, as I push that slider to the right, we're starting to make our bird here. We're losing a lot of detail in the feathers, and everything's starting to look very much kind of like a canvas oil painting. I know in the early days of using the sharpening panel here in Lightroom, I would play around with the noise reduction quite a bit, and I sometimes really enjoyed making everything look kind of like an oil painting until I decided, you know what, this isn't very realistic. So I'm just going to reset this here really quickly and give Lightroom a chance to catch up. And as you can see, now we have the noise back in the photo. So I'm just going to very carefully apply the noise reduction. And remember, guys, Lightroom sometimes takes a while to catch up with your adjustments. That really depends on the processing speed of your computer. I think I'm going to leave this roughly around 18%. And that's not too bad. If I hold Alt and start playing with this, you can get this grayscale view of how your adjustment is affecting the photo. So again, I'm going to reset here and I'm going to go probably about 15 to 18%. That's looking not too bad. And then you can pull some detail back out with the detail slider here. It's not a bad tool. It's very useful if you're shooting in low light situations. It's not going to make it look as sharp as you would if you didn't touch the luminance slider, but a useful tool down here to bring back some detail in your photos if you do affect the noise reduction in your photo. So I have this cranked up to 100%, and that's not too bad if I hit reset here, and again, just giving the Lightroom a second to catch up. If I push this back to the right, starting to get some detail brought back out in those feathers, not too bad. So that's just a quick and dirty rundown of the details panel. There's a few other tools in here like color and detail and smoothness. Truth be told, I really don't use these much because I never really see much of a benefit of using those adjusters there. So I'm going to collapse the details panel here. And now we're going to go into effects. And this is where you can apply, if I punch out here, where you can apply things like a vignette or add grain to your photo. And it is kind of a fun tool to play around with, especially if you want to introduce a vignette. So let's just do that. Let's introduce a vignette to this photo. And I am just going to slide it to the left. That's going to make my vignette darker. And what this does is it really helps draw the attention of your photo to your subject. So I have introduced a dark vignette, roughly around -24. And as you can see, it really kind of draws your attention to the bird. If I wanted to go the other way, I could introduce a white vignette, which kind of does the same thing. A white vignette is not something I typically apply in my photos. I find them to be sort of distracting. There are some artistic times when I find it to be kind of useful, but for the most part, I prefer to apply a dark vignette so I can draw focus to my subject. And you can affect where the vignette is applied if you grab the midpoint here and slide it. As you can see, we are expanding the midpoint of the vignette, so we're getting a little bit more sharp contrast in the corners here, but everything in the center has kind of been blown out a little bit more. We can slide it backwards, and we are decreasing the midpoint, and we're bringing that vignette, feathering it in even closer and closer. And actually, that's not bad down there at 0, but it's too much, so I'm just going to just gradually bring this back somewhere around 36 on the midpoint. And then you can adjust the feathering of the vignette to make it look a little bit natural or very sharp. As you can see here, I pushed this all the way to 2, and you have a very distinct circle vignette up here. Obviously, this looks very unnatural, so I'm going to undo that. And then vice versa, you can feather it out even more, make it look a little bit more natural. Again, I know it's hard to tell, so I'm going to push the vignette very dark just to give you guys an example of what this slider down here can do. As you can see, a very sharp, very oval vignette right there. If we push this out, it's much more feathered, a little bit less on the opacity. I'm going to reset this here and bring this back to what I had, which was, I think, around 17%. Just a very natural vignette to kind of help guide your eye towards the bird. You can affect the roundness of the vignette, make it more square or rounder. I don't really play with that ever. And then if I punch into the bird here, you can see we can affect the grain of the photo, maybe to make it look a little bit more of an old-time style photo, give it a little bit of a grainier texture. I know there are some street photographers that really like this tool right here. I don't really apply this with my wildlife or landscape photos, but that's just what that slider will do. And to be perfectly honest, guys, this is where I usually call it good with my photos. I don't do much with split toning, transform, or calibration. I will go through it here in this video, and I apologize if this video is starting to get a bit long, guys, but I wanted to give you guys a full rundown of how to develop a photo in Lightroom. So hopefully I can get through these last 3 effects here really quickly. Back into the effects panel really quick, you can affect where the vignette is applied. I have highlight priority selected, so the vignette will get applied to the highlighted areas in the corners of the photo. You can go down here and select color overlay instead, or you can select paint overlay. And again, obviously we're not seeing a lot of effect here, so I'm going to punch this in just a little bit more to give you guys an example of what these selections will do. I usually just leave it on highlight priority. And I'm going to reset this back to, what was it, -17. Again, you want to be kind of subtle with the vignette. So now we're going to drop down into the split toning section. And this is where you can affect the highlights and shadows of your photo and change the color, the saturation, and the balance in the shadows and highlights of your photo. So for example, I click on this gray little matte card looking thing in the highlights section, and when I click on that, it will pop up this panel. And this is where you can use this eyedropper tool to select the different color areas that you want to affect for your highlights or your shadows. It works exactly the same for the shadows. So an extreme example here, say I wanted to go blue for my highlights. That looks really ugly, but again, just as an example here, if I want my highlights to be bluer, I could click up here. I want to go a little bit more in the brown, very earthy tone color, so I'm going to click in here. That's a little bit too much, so I'm going to go maybe over into the red area. Let's see. Let's just play around with this. Something that looks good. I think that's starting to look really good right there. And then you can affect the saturation with this slider here by clicking and dragging. And as you can see, that little square is going up and down as I adjust. This just tells Lightroom how much saturation you want in your highlights here. I think somewhere around 15%. That's looking pretty good. So I'm going to click out of this. And then for my shadows, let's just play around here. Maybe if we want to go a little bit cooler in our shadows, somewhere around maybe like this in the blue area. That's looking pretty good. Again, saturation, not too much. Let's go to about maybe 15 right there. And if we toggle this on and off, you can see what it's doing to the photo. Again, I'm gone very, very subtle here. But as you can see, without it, we've got a very warm tone right here. If I toggle this on, we've gone a little bit more mixed with the highlights and shadows. And I can affect the balance of that. And so if, say, I want the shadows to be more predominant, I can slide this to the right, and those shadow tones are going to be more prominent than the highlight tones. If I want to go the other way and push it to the right, if I push it that way, our highlight tones are becoming more prominent than our shadow tones. So I'm just going to push this here. I liked that balance, but I'm going to go about 40% plus on the highlights there. And that's looking pretty good if I toggle this on and off here. Again, it's a very subtle change. I like to go subtle, but pretty subtle adjustment right there. So that is how split toning works. If we go down here to transform, now this doesn't really make sense for this photo to do these adjustments, but I'm going to show it anyway. Transform will come into effect, say if you have some architecture or you've shot something with a wide angle lens and the straight lines are bending one way or the other, you can affect that in this panel here. So just as an example, if I want to affect my vertical lines and stretch this bird out, I can do this like that. Give Lightroom a second here to catch up. So that looks kind of funky, kind of wonky. If we wanted to affect the horizontal, and again, guys, I'm just using this as an example here, we can pull it one way or the other. And just this is really useful tool if you want to affect architecture shots or anything of that nature. It really doesn't make sense for a wildlife image, so I am just going to turn that off. And now we're back to our regular photo here. And then calibration. Now this allows you to affect the primary color palette in your photo. Let's say I wanted the blues to be more saturated in this photo. I can go down here, click on the blues, and start dragging them to the right. Now this will affect anything in your primary color of your photo that has blue in it. Now think primary colors like when you were in school learning about the rainbow and what primary colors are and how they mix to create other colors. So I've just gone overboard here and I've pushed my blue saturation to the right to introduce maybe some lighter luminance on my blues. If I go the other way here, push it darker, and again, just give Lightroom a second here, we've taken out a lot of the blue tones in this photo, similar to what you could do with the HSL panel, but it's simply targeting the primary colors in the photo. I'm going to reset this, and I can just affect the hue in the photo. And same concept here, it's simply affecting the blue areas of the photo. And if I go up here to the red panel, again, if I push the saturation up, you can see in the red of the bird becoming much more saturated, and it's also affecting the oranges and yellows in this photo. I'm going to deselect that. Same with the greens. If I affect the green areas of the photo here, actually that's bringing out a nice kind of, I've gone too far again. Lightroom taking its time to catch up with my adjustments, but I'm just going to punch the greens up just a tad, just a little bit, and that's starting to look all right. So, and then you can also adjust the shadows, give them a more magenta or a greener tone to them. Again, I don't really touch this, but it's all in the name of creativity, guys. So I am going to just reset everything back to 0 because I like my photo the way it was. And that is it, guys. That is basically how you edit a photo in Lightroom. Now, I will probably spend a little bit more time making adjustments on this photo, getting it a little bit more how I would use it. I would probably do some more stuff in Photoshop to bring out and control some of these brighter areas and darker areas a little bit more. Again, Lightroom really just affects the editing locally and globally. It doesn't give you that fine select control. So I hope you guys found this tutorial useful. If you did, make sure you hit that thumbs up button. Make sure you're subscribed already. And I will be talking more about how to use these selective adjustments here in my next video. I know I didn't touch on these during this video. I want that to be its own video in itself. So until next time, guys, again, I hope you really found this video tutorial useful. And stay tuned. I'm going to have more videos coming up here very soon. And until next time, I will see you on the next video.